City pop. You've probably heard the name. Maybe in your YouTube recommendations or through the Stay With Me trend on TikTok. It's usually described as a Japanese music genre from the 1980s. Visually, it's almost always tied to the dreamy seaside scenes of Hiroshi Nagae. You know, the ones that look like a vacation brochure from 1983. That's the vibe most people think of when they hear city pop. But here's what I've been wondering. What if city pop wasn't actually a genre? As someone who listens to a lot of 80s music, I've always found this term a little weird. And in this video, I'll explain why. So without further ado, let's dive in. To understand the roots of what is now coined city pop, it's essential to trace Japan's evolving relationship with Western music. This cultural exchange began during the 1960s, a period marked by Japan's post-war recovery and rapid economic growth. American rock and jazz quickly found fans in Japan, laying the groundwork for a musical landscape increasingly receptive to Western styles. The 1970s saw this influence deepen. Disco and rock from the West permeated Japanese airwaves, inspiring local artists to experiment and adapt to these styles. By the 1980s, Japan's music scene was a vibrant slushy of genres, with rockabilly experiencing a notable resurgence. Bands like the Checkers and artists such as Masahiko Kondo embodied this trend, blending traditional rockabilly aesthetic with Japanese sensibilities. One major change in the 1980s was the decline of enka, a genre characterized by its traditional Japanese music scales and emotive vocal style. Once a dominant force in the charts, enka's presence waned as Western-influenced music gained prominence. To build on that, Japanese artists in the 1980s weren't just absorbing American pop culture, they were actively chasing it. I guess you could say Japan was deep in its Ameribu phase. A good amount of iconic J-pop albums of the era were literally recorded in the US, often with top-tier American session musicians and producers. For example, Mariya Takeuchi's 1980 album, Love Songs, highlight just how deeply Japanese pop was intertwined with American studios. Google might say that this album was recorded in Japan, but with a lineup that's about 80% American, that sounded pretty unlikely to me. Labels love saving money, and flying top-tier session players all the way to Tokyo doesn't sound very budget-friendly. So I decided to reach out to the musicians themselves. The first musician who got back to me was Jerry Sheff, a legendary bassist who's mostly known by the general public for playing with Elvis Presley. He told me that as far as he could recall, the sessions took place in Los Angeles. Thanks again to Mr. Sheff for his precious time. Jerry wasn't the only icon on this record. Also featured is the legendary jazz pianist and composer David Benoit. By the way, if you're into soft 80s jazz instrumentals, I highly recommend his solo work. Equally notable is Gene Page, who handled the arrangements. He was an American composer, arranger, and record producer who worked with everyone from Aretha Franklin to Barry White. He's been part of thousands of projects, many rooted in Motown, which might explain the classic feel of Lonely Wind. As you can see, rather than imitating the American sound from across the ocean, Mariya Takeuchi and her team went straight to the source, crafting a sound that felt more like California than Tokyo. Takeuchi wasn't the only one recording in the US at the time. Toshiki Kadomatsu followed the same path. His second album, We Can Fly to the Sun, released in 1982, was recorded in Los Angeles and featured American session legends such as Nathan East and Louis Johnson, both of whom played bass on Michael Jackson's Thriller. Yeah, only the greatest pop album of all time. No big deal. The arrangements were handled by TomTom84, best known for his horn work with Earth, Wind and Fire. He even went on to collaborate with other Japanese artists like Meiko Nakahara, showing just how closely these musical worlds were connected. Across these examples, the common thread isn't geography or language, it's aspiration. The Japanese music industry of the 1980s was head over heels with American pop culture. Even though the vast majority of city pop albums were recorded in Japan with Japanese musicians, the intent of the music wasn't to make something that sounded Japanese. And that's the critical point. What we now call city pop wasn't about life in Tokyo. It was about dreaming of Los Angeles. This music was created by people who grew up in post-war Japan. They were shaped by American music and American films. I would even say that city pop was an ode to the American dream. Oddly enough, much of the music wasn't even chart-topping at the time, while the internet now frames city pop as the ultimate sound of 1980s Japan. It was just one sound in a diverse and competitive music scene. Kaiokoku was by far the most popular genre at the time. So, if city pop was more about emulating the American sound than creating something new, why does the internet treat it like a whole separate genre? This has a lot to do with how millennials and Gen Z organize culture. We're not just classifying music by sound anymore, we classify it by vibes and aesthetic. For a lot of these listeners, music isn't something you discover in a record store. It's something you find through playlists and TikTok trends. The music matters, but not as much as the world it seems to come from. City pop, as a label, rose because 80s J-pop became deeply intertwined with vaporwave and future funk, two internet subcultures that gained momentum in the 2010s. Both vaporwave and future funk had very strong visual identities playing into nostalgia. Recognizable yet foreign, city pop brings out an elusive feeling of nostalgia for 1980s Japan that frankly never quite existed. Younger generations tend to romanticize eras they never lived through as a form of escapism from modern issues. And because city pop is tied to Japan, especially during its last big economic boom, that nostalgia gets cranked up even more. In reality, 1980s Japan had plenty of problems of its own. Teenage delinquency, organized crimes, political corruption, racism towards minorities like the Ainu and Zainichi Koreans. That's without mentioning the harsh treatment of factory workers at companies like Toyota. None of this fits into the retro anime fantasy often pushed online, so it gets swept under the rug. And this is the point where we have to talk about the fetishization of Japanese culture. I know it's gonna bum some of you out, but we have to talk about it. For some city pop fans, the label became a way of saying, I like this because it's Japanese, and not I like this because it sounds cool. I think it goes back to this fantasy version of Japan. You know, the one that's always portrayed as quiet and totally homogeneous. This perception influences how Japanese music is received. A lot of videos and articles talk about city pop like it came out of a vacuum, when in reality it was deeply influenced by American music. Tatsuro Yamashita himself has always expressed his love for the Beach Boys and Motown. That love clearly shines through in his music. Another reason why people separate city pop from similar music is because of subtle cultural biases. The artists were not hiding that they collaborated with American musicians, especially African American ones. But modern fans like to gloss over that fact, for whatever reason. Some specific fans would never gravitate towards 80s African American R&B and funk even though it sounds just like city pop. Actually, some actively snub black music by saying that it's not real music. To be honest, it's not just black artists who are being overlooked. Even white American acts who sound exactly like city pop barely get mentioned. Let me be clear. I'm not saying Japanese artists were copying or stealing. Getting the sound right is one thing. Anyone can buy a DX7 and a DMX to nail the retro sound. But writing good songs is the real difficult thing. And city pop has plenty of great songs. My point is that this music grew out of shared influence and cultural appreciation. And if you want to understand city pop, and I mean really understand it, you can't separate it from the black and western music that shaped it. Because honestly, city pop isn't all that different from the American music of the time. I mean, they share the same DNA after all. And if you don't believe me, here are some examples. The Girl Is Mine by Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney is basically city pop. Christopher Cross, same energy. I could even name Phyllis St. James. She's a little forgotten today, but back in 1984, she dropped her album Ain't No Turning Back, and if it was sung in Japanese, it would be praised as a lost city pop gem. Personally, I love this album. Shout out to whoever mentioned her under Dancing on Glass by Motley Crue.
Whoever you are, thank you.
Unfortunately, these artists rarely get mentioned in city pop circles. But it checks out, since it's not a genre in the traditional sense. It doesn't have distinct musical boundaries, it doesn't rely on exotic scales, and its chord progressions are straight out of jazz and R&B. I think city pop is more of a cultural label, a retrofitted term that reflects how younger people experience nostalgia and identity. It says more about how we see the past and choose to engage with it than it does about the music. On a lighter note, if city pop got you into Japanese music, that's awesome. I'm not saying you're wrong for enjoying Plastic Love. Hey, I love it too. But don't stop there because you're missing out on plenty of good music. If you're looking for new music, I have a video that could just help you. Feel free to check it out. That will be it for today. Thank you for watching and see you next time!